Good day, everybody. It's great to have you with us, to have you with me in conversation today with Steve Simpson. If this is your first time using Webinar Jam, just familiarize yourself with it. It's the same as all the others. If you're on your computer, on the right-hand side, you've got a little control panel, which includes a chat box. Why don't you just use that right now to just dive in and say hi and tell us where you're logging in from. That'll also show you where to go to put questions. We are going to be able to take questions today. So make sure you head across to the chat box and so on. Evan, you've been to most of my in conversations. This is the first time you're the first person in. And that's pretty impressive from a chilly morning, I think, this morning in Pretoria. And there we go. Carla, welcome, Carla. You were in our session that Steve and I had last week as well from Brisbane. So we're getting people from all over the world coming in. Right. Well, it's great to have you with us wherever you are, and sit back, relax, and enjoy the conversation that Steve and I are going to have. Steve Simpson is actually a really good mate of mine. He and I have known each other, Steve, about 20 years?
Yeah.
And kind of kept the friendship going across the world, right?
Yes.
Steve is an expert on workplace culture. In fact, for all of those 20 years, Steve, as long as I've known you, you've been working on systems and methods of understanding how we can understand culture. And what workplace culture is. And that's what our conversation is about today. We'll introduce Steve a little bit more formally as we go along. He's the founder of a system called UGRs, and we're going to get into all of that in the next few minutes as we chat. So Steve, with nothing more than that, let me throw you the obvious question as one of the world's workplace culture experts. Is workplace culture still a thing? I mean, we're all working from home. Does workplace culture even matter anymore?
Well, that's a good question to start with, Graeme, because prior to COVID, we used to argue the case for culture. And frankly, I think this needs to happen. And we did some research around this question, which we later decided was a really golden question. And the question we asked in our research was this: if the culture of your workplace was to become as good as it realistically could, how much improvement would there be on people's performance/productivity? Now, Graeme, we did research on that. We gave people a sliding scale. And after doing the research, I used to present the results. But prior to presenting the results, I would ask leadership teams to ponder that question for them and their business. If the culture of our workplace was to become as good as it realistically could, how much improvement would there be on people's performance/productivity? And when I asked it face-to-face, Graeme, the average, and this is mostly in Australia, not only, I've done work in South Africa and the UK and some other countries, invariably the average would come around 40% improvement. 40%. Now, this is massive, and this is pre-COVID. Now, I used to say to people, let's presume you're wildly over-optimistic, halve it, 20%, would you take it? It's a stupid question, right? Where else would you gain those sorts of performance improvement gains? So now we have COVID, and it's my view that there has never been a time more so than now for organisations to focus on their culture. Why? Because of the immense fear, stress, and uncertainty that each and every one of us on the planet has felt during these past 8 weeks or so. This, I think, tells us that culture is more important than ever. Everything has changed.
But Steve, can I just interrupt you there? So that was what 40% is what they say were hoping for or thought was possible. You kind of try to offer them 20% and see if they'd take it. Of course they would. But I know you've worked for 20 years in organizations all around the world. What is the actual performance gain that people do when they start to put effort and energy into culture? I mean, my guess is it might even be more than 40%, isn't it?
Well, we've seen massive turnarounds, Graeme, because probably my best example would be Kmart in Australia and New Zealand, not associated with the US Kmart, completely separate entity, but a discount department store. And when I began working with them around 10 years ago, they had literally lost money for 10 years in a row. 10 consecutive years they had lost money. Their CEO, Guy Russo, the best leader I've ever met, loved my concept of UGRs, which we'll talk about in a moment, and deployed that as the vehicle to both understand and transform their culture. Now, culture cannot be attributed to the total turnaround of Kmart, but it was one of 4 planks or improvement planks that Guy Russo and his leaders put in place. They are now, without a shadow of doubt, recognised as Australia's leading retailer. Last year alone, they made $500 million profit, $500 million. And this is 10 years prior, having lost money for 10 years in a row. Now, culture has so many influences on it that it's very difficult to say, we improve culture by this much, there's the performance gain. But that's a classic example. And Guy Russo says this, he says, in a public forum with around 400 or 500 people in the room, he says, only 2 things you've got to worry about in your business model and your culture. That's it. Get those right and away you go.
Okay, so obviously Guy has worked out something, and obviously you have as well, that's why I'm talking to you, that a lot of people haven't, because I think one of the criticisms of talking about culture is that everybody puts it in air quotes, because especially senior leaders tend to think, well, this is a little bit, it's the soft stuff, it's indefinable. We all know what we mean, but then actually we don't know what we mean at all. And for me, when I've seen the work that you do, the thing that impressed me the most was I think you found a way to make culture not only visible, that's not even the right word. You found a way to make culture something that people can actually talk about in actual real words, without any sort of the mumbo jumbo that often goes around culture. I mean, I'm sort of mumbling a little bit because that's exactly what a lot of people do as soon as you start talking culture. You see it differently, right?
100%. And I used to, I don't do this anymore, but I used to have a bit of a joke around culture by saying to people, culture's important, isn't it? And they would knowingly nod. And I've got senior leaders in the room. They would knowingly nod. And I would say, well, so what does it mean? Help us understand what it means. Eyes would divert from me because they didn't want to be picked on. And then I, as a joke, show, look, here it is. I can make it easy for you. And I put up definitions from Edgar Schein, the man who's attributed as creating the notion of workplace culture. And it took 3 PowerPoint slides to share his definition. It was so complex, so complicated. And I think culture's been bedeviled by that fact, as you're alluding to, Graeme, pretty much ever since. So I created the concept of UGRs, which stands for Unwritten Ground Rules, which I define as people's perceptions of this is the way we do things around here. That definition is vitally important. People's perceptions of this is the way we do things around here. And they can include things like, at our meetings, it isn't worth complaining because we know nothing will get done. The only time when we get spoken to by the boss is when something is wrong. In a mining context, just unearth this one in, no pun intended there, Graeme, unearth this one in a gold mine in South Africa, as a matter of fact. There was a UGR which says, around here, production is more important than safety, which is pretty scary if you think about it. In a customer service context, it can be, a UGR can be, the organisation talks about the importance of customer service, but we know other things are more important, so we don't really have to worry about it, and so on. These drive people to behaviour.
So can I just interrupt you there? Because, I mean, that mining example freaks me out a little bit because, of course, everybody in the company has looking at the posters all day, every day, saying safety is our number one priority, or in the retail store, at every staff pause point, there is customer is number one. So it's not what the bosses are saying. It's not what's up on the walls in the reception area. It's people's perceptions of what actually matters, right? Precisely. Am I understanding that?
Precisely. And when a new person starts a job, and it doesn't matter how senior they are, this is almost a 100% rule. A new person starts a job, and they can be senior. They will be quieter than they otherwise would. Why? Because they're checking out the UGRs. Now, we don't have the term UGRs in our heads, but this is a natural human instinct. Whenever we're confronted with a new group of people, so it's not confined to work, we'll normally stay quieter than we otherwise would. Why? Because we're checking out the UGRs. Why? In order that we can conform. That's the power of UGRs. So your point, Graeme, extends to new people to a business. They're told during their induction and orientation, this is the way we do things around here. Well, when we really start, we can actually push that to one side because we're going to stay quiet and check out the way we really do things around here. And so if we see that people at a meeting don't say anything, it's highly unlikely that we'll start saying something at meetings. If no one ever offers a different point of view at a meeting, it's highly unlikely as a new person will present something, a different point of view. So we unconsciously mostly tune into this stuff and unconsciously mostly conform to the prevailing UGRs, which, by the way, I think can be a massive source of workplace stress, which I think hasn't been explored to any detail whatsoever. And that is when I personally feel compelled to conform to prevailing UGRs, which are opposed to my personal values. Having said that, the company's UGRs will normally win. You will normally comply.
Yeah. So, Steve, we are going to come back to talking about UGRs and what they are and how people can work with them. But I want to sort of jump to the end of the conversation and then reverse engineer, because I want people to understand why. Actually, don't tell this to the other people I'm interviewing this week, but you were the one that I was most looking forward to interviewing, because I'm most passionate. You know, this whole series of In Conversation with Graeme Codrington is about saying to people, once you've got through the crisis of whatever version of lockdown and COVID disruption you're dealing with, that kind of spinning your wheels and freaking out, and you sort of settling down, once you're beginning to realize, and this is the work that I do with clients, that this is at least 12 to 18 months of deep disruption as we need to keep physically distancing and changing the way that we work. So you can't just grit your teeth and power through the next few weeks and then we'll all go back to normal. And I think that after we've finished the whole thing, even 3, 5, 10 years from now, we'll have moved quite significantly to not a work from home environment. Not everybody's loving working from home, but we'll have shifted into a work from anywhere mindset. There'll be a lot more working from anywhere. There'll be a lot more hybrid work situations. There'll be a lot more fluidity around core hours and office, because people won't have the excuse anymore, it doesn't work. So we're shifting. I think this is the greatest experiment in the future of work in the history of humanity, and I think it's going to work. And so we're going to shift dramatically to having teams a lot more geographically dispersed, people being a lot more comfortable with virtual environments, virtual teams. Why then? And I know you're going to come back and explain UGRs in more detail, but let's jump to the end. Why would it be, I think, even more important in a geographically dispersed environment, in a virtual team situation, to take culture seriously? And then we'll come back and explain how you take culture seriously. But why is it going to be even more important? Well, do you agree with me that it will be more important, and why?
Well, it's a really interesting angle, Graeme, and you and I have had lots of conversations in recent times, and I haven't heard that angle before, but it's a really interesting one that you're putting. And to be honest with you, I hadn't thought of that angle. But here's what we have unearthed in our work on UGRs in many organisations in many countries over 20 to 30 years. And that is, and I used to say this to leaders almost offhand, I would say, so what's the physical structure of your organisation? Is there physical dispersion, or are you all located in one place? Because the obvious next step after asking that question is to make the point, if you're physically dispersed, it makes it much more difficult. And this applies not only regionally, but internationally as well. If you've got different teams in different countries, it makes it much more difficult to both understand and improve the culture. So your point about geographical dispersion, Graeme, I think makes it more difficult and therefore more important. Now, there's a whole other layer that has to be added to this. And of course, the other layer is our recent circumstances and our circumstances into the next 18 months, as you're predicting. Because, I mean, it's not a matter now of whether or not people have been stressed over the past 8 or so weeks. The question is, how much stress has each individual endured? I mean, I felt it massively. I don't know about you, Graeme, but people have felt stress, fear, literally fear. I felt it, and uncertainty. Yeah. Now, add those onto this context of geographical dispersion like we've never experienced before, and it makes culture even more important. And I don't know if you want to go down this path, but I've got some thoughts about some non-negotiable cultural attributes that any organisation and every organisation ought to be pursuing given this current circumstance.
No, well, let's go there, but I'm going to help you to not jump too far ahead of the curve here, because I've pushed you to where I really want to go. Let's back it up a little bit, because you've just used a little bit of lingo, so key cultural attributes and so on. Just step back for us a little bit. I'm fortunate to have seen your UGRs process in action. And by the way, I've dropped Steve's website, the UGRs.net, into the chat box. If you can't see the chat box, it's UGRS. So UGRs.net. Go and check it out. And they've got some great resources there. You can sign up for some of the stuff. But just back us up a bit, because what you've done more than anything I've ever seen anywhere else in the world, and I've looked for this stuff because I'm passionate about it and I think it's critical for businesses, you've given people a way to talk about culture. So what I've seen you do is you come in and you chat to the people throughout the organization, not just the senior leaders, to try and uncover which unwritten ground rules are going to make the most impact on the actual way the business works. And then you turn that into simple statements in easy to use language. So it's not consultant speak, it's not executive office speak, it's just people can speak to each other about them. And is that what you call key cultural attributes, those key things that will change the business? Or do you want to give us a little bit of definition around how you use UGRs in a business?
Yeah, well, and you're right, Graeme, and that's the first of our 5-step process for using UGRs as the vehicle to both understand and improve the culture. So our first step, which is called Envision, says, forget about UGRs for the moment, because there is another golden question we can share with leaders. And the question is this, and this is what we used to ask up until COVID. Things have changed since then, but this is a bit of a golden question. The question is, what are the key cultural attributes we need in place for us to truly be successful while making this a great place to work? My point here is that we need to get strategic with our culture. Most companies have value statements, but I really fear that value statements are conceived in a vacuum and almost by asking the question, well, what do we want our values to be? And they just...
No. You're completely wrong about that. Value statements were designed at Harvard 30 years ago. I'll tell you what they are: trust, integrity, respect, and customer service. I don't know why you even have to have this conversation, mate. I mean, we all know what they are.
Well, I'm just trying to be more diplomatic, Graeme. That's the bottom line.
But surely you can charge $1 million to go in and hand those 4 over to a company. McKinsey does it all the time.
I should have gone to Harvard. I should have. So we think the whole notion and don't get me wrong. So many companies are dedicated to their value statements and have good intentions behind them, but it's the framing of them that makes so much importance. And I think that's where our question reframes the whole notion. What does our culture need to look and feel like for us to truly be successful while making this a great place to work? Now, the answers to that can sound like value statements, and you can call them value statements if you want. That's fine. But the question reframes the whole notion as the foundation upon which everything sits, and necessary for us to be successful while making it a great place to work. Now, it's only
and one of the keys, Steve, isn't it, that you don't ask the executive team on the 17th floor boardroom this question. You're asking everybody this question, right?
We advocate that we go to as many people as possible, but there is a rider on this. The senior leadership team must be the final arbiters of this. Now, there's a risk.
Yeah, sure.
There's a risk when we go to. I'll give you an example. One time, we went to everyone with that question in the organisation, and I produced the report. Was about to have a session with the senior leadership team with the results from going to everyone with that question. And prior to that, I had a meeting with the CEO, and I said to the CEO, "So what do you think?" And he said, "Steve, I'm devastated." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Customer service has come in at about number 27 on our list. They're thinking about me. Now, that's where leadership strategy needs to come into play in interpreting this, because the risk is that people will only think about themselves. That's the world they live in. They don't have the strategic view. So leaders need to be arbiters of the final outcomes of this. But it is a great step to starting to get people involved in thinking about and being part of the culture transformation, because this is something that's missed out in most attempts to change cultures, that is, involving staff, believe it or not.
Now, this is where, for me, it gets real now in a COVID time, and those people live with us, please throw in any questions if you are live with us. If you're watching the replay, this is for me where my kind of passion comes up, because as you've said, Steve, you know, for the 8 weeks now that most of us have been in lockdown or disruption or whatever version there is in your country, people have been running hard. I agree with you. You know, some people that I've seen every now and again saying, well, I'm learning a new language or a hobby. I mean, I don't know who those people are. Certainly nobody in my network has been doing that. And in fact, I've begun to hear a lot of my corporate leader kind of mates saying, I'm so impressed with my team. You know, they're actually producing more than I could have imagined. They're actually doing better than they were doing when we were in the office. There's good news in that, but there's also a warning sign, because people are running a marathon at sprint speed. Yeah. If it was only 8 weeks or maybe 10 weeks and you got a little bit of the end is in sight now, you know, I started life in the accounting world. If this was a year end, we'd all be heads down. We'd be 18 hours working through weekends, but we'd know that it was coming to an end soon. And we'd be pacing ourselves, knowing we're burning at, you know, the candle at both ends, but it's nearly done. We got 12 to 18 months of this left. And I think leaders are in danger of encouraging their people to sprint the first few kilometers of this marathon. And by the halfway point, everybody's going to be falling over, literally falling over, with no energy left and not being able to finish the race. And so I think this conversation about culture is absolutely vital now. If leaders just are talking about, how do I work you harder? How do I, even if I'm doing it in a lovely, encouraging way, complimenting you for how hard you're working, I'm not going to be able to give you your bonus at the end of the year anyway, because the company doesn't have any budget left, has no money. So there's nothing in it for you, which is okay for 8 to 10 weeks, not okay for 8 to 10 months, not okay for 18 months. So surely this issue now is going to become vital. This is going to be the next thing people are going to have to do. Speak to your teams about what the culture needs to be now. Am I barking up the wrong tree? Are you agreeing with me?
Not at all. I love the angle you're putting on it, and I think that's a really good analogy. You know, that this is a marathon. It's not a sprint.
Yeah.
And lesson number 1, always turn off mobile phones when doing a webinar.
I'm going to do mine quickly. I thought that was mine as that went off.
So there's a couple, Graeme, I think your point's a really good one. there's a couple of options then that I would say are open to people. One is to modify the question, my golden question, and that is, rather than saying what does our culture need to look and feel like for us to truly be successful while making it a great place to work, maybe the question could be, what does our culture need to look and feel like to help us best navigate our path through and beyond this crisis? So we can modify the question just slightly. But having said that, that was the first phase of our thinking as this crisis hit, that we needed to modify that question. But I've actually changed my view a little bit on this even since then, Graeme, and now I'm proposing that there are 4 cultural attributes that ought to be non-negotiable in just about every organisation. And this is in recognition of the fear, uncertainty and stress that everyone is feeling to varying degrees. Not a matter of if, just a matter of how much. And the 4 cultural attributes that I'm arguing, and Steph, my business partner in South Africa, we are arguing that there are 4 non-negotiable cultural attributes that ought to be being driven within organisations right now. And they are these. Transparency. In the face of the uncertainty that people are feeling, they need to know where the organisation is headed and their place within it. Now, transparency includes saying, I don't know if that's your understanding. If you don't know, then saying I don't know is warranted and necessary. Transparency is one. Agility is another. If you aren't now able to get agile and move quickly, then good luck, because your competitors are. So each of us need to get very agile, and we need to be able to make quick decisions, make good decisions, and move quickly. So transparency, agility. The third is creativity and innovation, because again, if you're not thinking about being as creative as you possibly can and as innovative as you possibly can, then good luck. And the fourth, and maybe the most important, is what we're calling support and care, because again, in the face of this immense fear, stress and uncertainty that people feel, we need to care for our people. I was talking with a senior leader from an large Australian franchise company fairly recently. I rang him for no other reason than saying, how are things? And when we talked, he used these words, Graeme. He said, it's been a bloodbath. He'd had to sack people. He was doing the sprint, Graeme, as you refer to it. He was running on adrenaline. And I really felt for him, because I wondered whether anyone was caring for him. You know, there's a real risk that leaders are desperately caring for the people that they're having to work with. But as leaders, are we looking after each other as well? So this should never be just one directional. It's my view that those are the 4 attributes that we must try to lock in for us to get through this.
Yeah. So, Steve, help people to understand this. For me, the genius of UGRs is that you kind of, once you got the concept and you understand that you've got to just find these key attributes, you then got to get people talking about them so that they holding each other to account to make them happen. So I love those 4. I've put them in the chat box for everybody. Transparency, agility, creativity and innovation, support and care. What could a leader do right now to put those 4 things into the system? How do you get people talking about them? How do you get people holding each other to account to make them visible in the workplace?
Okay, so this is where UGRs comes back into play, because after we've agreed on what our aspirational culture is, this is the envision step, deciding on getting crystal clear about what we're fighting for culture-wise. Then we can find out what the UGRs are in relation to each of these attributes. And this leans on world-first research undertaken by 2 Australian universities, where we get people to complete what we now call lead-in sentences. Lead-in sentences. So, for example, for transparency, I wonder if your people felt completely anonymous about responding to this, how would they complete this lead-in sentence? Around here, when it comes to knowing about what's going on in the business, complete the sentence. Now that sheds a light on the UGRs in relation to the cultural attribute of transparency. For support and care, I wonder how your people would complete this sentence. Around here, when someone's having a hard time. Or, around here, people are treated. Again, I wonder how they complete that. For creativity and innovation, I wonder how your people would complete this sentence. Around here, when someone comes up with a new idea.
So, I mean, I'm just thinking about what my small team. So you know, we've got a small team, but I mean, we've been working virtually for 20 years. We haven't ever paid a cent in rent. We've got people working across 4 different continents and so on. So I'm just trying to imagine what my team might say. We are on the transparency and trust one. Give me that lead-in sentence again for the transparency and trust.
Transparency could be, and there's multiple different lead-ins
Sure.
we could use, but an example would be around here when it comes to knowing about what's going on in the business.
Sure. So I think we do pretty well on this one because we had an all hands meeting last Monday and we basically put the entire financial statements out on the table, including all of the reserves we've got. We then showed it's a small company, so we can do this, but we then showed what every single person was earning, what the cuts that every single person were taking. Only the top half of the business took cuts. The people who are support staff, we guaranteed their salaries for 3 months, and hopefully can roll that forward, you know, each month from now on. But we wanted to give them that timeline, and we got such an amazing response from people just saying thank you. Some people saying, "Oh, that's worse than we thought it was." Most people saying, sure, that's actually better than I thought it was because we didn't know we had as many reserves as we do. Thank you for sharing with us the plan. Even if it's a little bit scary, I think we did a good thing in just opening up. Now, it's not only financial transparency you're talking about. I think it's got to do with sharing fears and other things as well. But that little financial transparency really worked a treat with our team. So that I think our team would give us a good rating on that one, that there is transparency in the system.
Well, I predict, Graeme, knowing you as well as I do, I predict that your team would have a lot of positive UGRs. So one thing I should have mentioned right from the word go was that the examples of UGRs that I gave at the start were mostly negative. That is not the case with UGRs. If you have a positive team right now, by definition, it follows there are positive UGRs. If you have an ordinary team right now, it follows by definition there are ordinary UGRs. But the key question around all of this is, are our current UGRs a function of luck or chance, or are they by design? Now, unless we're consciously thinking about and trying to transform and constantly improve our culture, then it's like, what's the book title? It's Hope is Not a Strategy. I mean, it's a good title. Yeah.
Yes.
And I fear that that's the case with many organisations, that they're hoping that their culture can, if it's good, stay good. If it's not good, they hope it's going to get better. But that's about as far as it goes. And I think it's incumbent on us as leaders, if there's 20% performance improvement to be gained or more, it's incumbent on us as leaders to do something about this. Because if you don't, and you know that that capacity improves, don't tell your board because they wouldn't be happy. You know, I think, and this is what I think you've been saying, Graeme, is that UGRs makes this tangible. It makes it accessible for people, because all of a sudden we have a language and a structure. And I've only talked about the 2 steps of our 5-step process. The first being envision, define our aspirational culture, and the second being assess, which is to say, well, what are the current UGRs in relation to the culture that we're fighting for? There's other steps which I'm happy to make a booklet available.
Give us the 3 other steps quickly. Do the full sales job
very quickly. The 3rd step is called teach, which says teach everyone in the business about the concept of UGRs. The short version is this: some of your people right now are subscribing to negative UGRs, are doing so unconsciously. We have discovered that when we teach people about the concept of UGRs in a fun way, in an interesting way, that of itself can often improve the culture, because people realise, hey, I'm playing the game of UGRs. So I say to leaders, you are primarily, but not solely, responsible for the culture. Now, many leaders feel good about that because they carry too much burden of the culture on their shoulders. They are primarily, but not solely. So staff have got to pick up their game here. Some staff play a game. If only they'd fix things up, we'd be okay. Well, that might partly be true, but it's not totally true. We all play the game of UGRs. So teach is the third step. The fourth step is...
So I'm going to interrupt you again. I know you won't forget the other steps, so I can. I think that this is vital in this COVID disrupted world. Again, if you only have the mindset of thinking this is just a few weeks, a little bit longer, we can power through it, fine. Then you'll get back to your normal work in a few weeks' time, and you can settle back into whatever culture you had. I don't think that that's the reality. I think we're 12 to 18 months of deep disruption in our workplaces. So even if this is it's temporary for 2 years, which means it's not temporary, and it's worth doing something about the culture you've got right now. And this is a good point, right? We've got to step back a moment right now. And I think literally 8 to 10 weeks into this is a good time to step back and take stock. And instead of just scheduling another productivity meeting, instead of just scheduling another, how are we going to get through this week meeting? I think you got to step back a little bit and say, are we all okay? That's a support and care question. But then, are we all okay in the way we are working? And are there things that need to change? And what you're saying there is step 3 is, you don't come in as the leader and tell people what to do, right? You don't say it's all for me to think about. You go in with a questioning, maybe even a curiosity attitude, is to say, are you all okay with this? Is it working okay? Yeah, Evan, who was the first person in this morning, also the first person to comment, just said this, and I think is a good contribution. We moved to work from home a few days before the lockdown began. In the first 2 weeks, everybody and their cat were scheduling endless meetings on MS Teams and Zoom. There was constant checking in, etc., because heaven forbid people should think that you're on holiday. Around here, if you're not at the office, you're on holiday. I mean, I think would be a thing in Evan's work. So the last week or two, though, you can see some form of normalization happening around people being more balanced with time and effort. Evan, I think your team is perfectly placed to step back and have this conversation. And to say, what do we want our workplace to look like if this is the new normal, even if just for a few months? Then how are we going to define the best version of this space? And then this whole concept of teaching about this is our culture, so how do we do it in a right way? Steve, you're saying that even having that conversation is a valuable part of the process, even if you don't implement an entire UGR system. Literally having the conversation can make a difference.
Yeah, and I think it goes beyond, and I know this is not what you're saying here, Graeme, it goes beyond saying, are you okay? It involves us really fighting collectively for an aspirational culture, which is going to get us through this, and then finding out what the UGRs are in relation to those. Now, here's another angle which you've just prompted in my mind from your interesting contribution then, Graeme, and that is the cues to pick up UGRs have changed. We all used to know where to look for and what to tune into to pick up the UGRs. So we go to a meeting and watch and listen. We'd see what was said immediately after the meeting. We would look at what happens when something goes wrong. And most of us physically could see these things occur, and we were...
You didn't see body language, right, Steve? I mean, I remember as clear as day, the one time I was doing some work with a senior executive team, and I knew it was a controversial statement. I knew I was just going out a little bit, and every single person in the room looked at the CEO and waited for his reaction. He took about 10 seconds to process and then leant back in his chair and just laughed out loud. And then the whole room burst into laughter. I mean, it was the most frightening thing to see, but also the most indicative of what I was actually dealing with.
Well, that's a classic. Yeah. That's a classic example. Now, here's the thing, which I've only realised in the last couple of weeks. Most of the cues have changed because we don't have physical meetings like that anymore. Now, I'll give you an example of this. I was running in the early days of lockdown a meeting with a group around UGRs. And one of the people left the meeting, like turned off left the Zoom meeting, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, that person was unhappy with what they thought was a snide remark made in the chat box by one of the other staff. Okay?
Yeah.
So the cues have changed. Now, I am gobsmacked, for example, and don't take this the wrong way, all of you guys here, because we're really welcoming your comments in the chat box. But this adds a whole other dimension to UGRs. If someone is talking and there are jokes happening in the chat box, which I've literally seen, if that was in a physical meeting and there were 3 people talking over there having a laugh during a meeting, the rest of us would be going, hello, what's going on here? But the equivalent to that is happening in Zoom meetings regularly now. So there's a whole new vehicle for us to take our cues from. Now, some of us are taking the cues incorrectly, but all the more reason to tune into this and get a better understanding of what our ground rules need to be. And you know, I just think so much has changed, which makes it even more important.
So I got you a little bit off track there. You were going to give us the 5 steps of UGRs. Take us to the 4th step.
Okay, so we've got envision, we've got assess, which is find out what the current UGRs are. Teach everyone in the business, and I mean everyone, about the concept of UGRs. The 4th step is called involve. Involve everyone in crafting positive UGRs that would demonstrate that our cultural attributes are alive and well. So I love doing this, getting staff involved to say, well, okay, if transparency was actually happening, what are some possible positive UGRs that would be in place that would demonstrate that attribute is alive and well? And it begins with...
So sorry, let me make sure I understand this, Steve. So the cultural attribute is kind of the thing that might go on a value statement. So transparency or agility or creativity. And now what we're wanting to do is get people to tell us what it would look like if it actually existed. So how would I be able to know that we're being agile? How would I be able to know that we're being creative? So it takes it off of the wall on the poster and puts it into actual actions. Is that what you're saying?
100%, Graeme. And the wording of this is important. We start with the words around here and we say it as though it already exists. So for transparency, and we advocate that staff ought to be involved in crafting these words because we want this to have meaning for everyone. Now, we were in a bind a little while back because we were working with a large organisation, very successful, that was part of a conglomerate of companies, and their values were dictated. They could not change their values. One of their values was boldness. Now, look, I can tell you the organisation. It was Kmart, okay? So discount department store, 30,000 people in Australia, including people at checkouts and what have you. What's a positive UGR that would demonstrate to them that boldness is alive and well? Well, what's boldness got to do with them at a checkout, for example? So they got around that issue by crafting words that had meaning for everyone in the business. And their words were something to the effect, around here, we all welcome new ideas to do things better. So that's strictly, I mean, there's a bit of a, disconnect there, but that's as good as they could get it to craft a positive UGR linked to the value or cultural attribute. Hope that makes sense, Graeme.
No, but that sounds like a super important point, because often those values, lists of values, even if there's a little bit of a democratization of the process, They're approved by the executive after they've gone through both legal and compliance and an external marketing campaign. So they these big suitcase words: accountability and initiative. And, what does initiative look like, as you say, to the receptionist, to the security guard, I can actually bring in one of Richard's comments. Richard is someone I've worked with, works with a big youth agency in the UK. In fact, I can bring in a question here that he's put in, because he's got issues. He's got it's a charity that's looking after homeless young people and so on. So that's got big issues. Then he's got a whole lot of furloughed staff who are kind of, taking the UK government scheme that helps them out financially, but they're not in the system, but they're still in the system because he wants to bring them back as soon as possible. And then he's got the frontline people who are actually got all of this fear. So hugely complex. And I mean, this is the point. We are in a hugely complex time. And what you don't want is those people trying to say, well, how do I show integrity and trust and accountability? You want them to say something like, around here, if I try something if I try something that hasn't been tried before and it doesn't work, my boss has got my back. Exactly. I mean, that's what initiative needs to translate to in today's world. So we've got to have these conversations with our team to say, well, what does it look like? If you're showing initiative in a completely disruptive world and it doesn't quite work out, I've got your back. And that's better language than that list of values on a wall, right?
Sometimes when I get people to do this, they come up with management speak. And I will say, that's management speak. Make it simpler. This has got to be, we've got to be able to resonate with this. All of us have got to be able to resonate with this. This has got to have meaning for us. So we've got to bring meaning to the cultural attributes or values that we're fighting for. We've got to bring meaning to everyone. What does that mean for me? That's the fourth step. Shall I proceed, Graeme, with the fifth?
Go for it.
The fifth step is called embed. And the embed phase says, how can we translate the talk of all of this? The previous four steps is all talk. How can we translate that into the reality? How can we embed this as part of our ongoing way we do things around here? So we say there are two non-negotiable strategies. One is our values or cultural attributes and positive UGRs ought to be visible for people to see. They must be visible. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient. The second non-negotiable strategy is this. Let me come at this from a different direction. I was working with a major organisation in the UK, a major organisation. You would all know this organisation. And I said I was working with one division. I said to their leaders this question. And I would love to do research on this question because I think this is a terrific question. The question was this. If I go to your people, so I'm talking to leaders now, if I go to your people and you're not in the room and they're being open and honest, and I ask them this question, what would they say? What are your leaders' top 3 priorities?
Great question.
Now, to the enormous credit of one of those leaders, he said this, Steve, we don't even know what our top 3 priorities are, so how would they? Now, what's my point? My point is there are so many competing demands on leaders. They are getting it from every direction, every day, and everyone is saying this has got to be a priority. That's part of the job of leaders, to sift through that and work out what the real priorities are. But my point is, if culture isn't a top 3 priority, then don't waste your time on any of this UGR stuff. Because it must be, I used to say top 5, now I say no, it's got to be a top 3 priority. If it's not a top 3 priority, it will not gain traction. If it is a top 3 priority, then you will demonstrate that it is in 2 main ways. One is you will have meetings where everyone in the organisation, every 2 or 3 weeks, goes to a meeting and there's an agenda item, a standing agenda item that talks to our culture. And there's two parts to the conversation. What are we doing well? What are the opportunities for improvement? So it doesn't take long for people to realise, gee, they're serious about this. The second thing, that if this is going to be a top 3 priority, the second thing that leaders must do is they must think very carefully about the questions that they ask and don't ask. Because your people will deduce your top 3 priorities, not from what you tell them are your top 3 priorities, but from the questions that you ask and don't ask. And so if that's true, then leaders must think about, well, what are some of the questions that we could ask potentially that would demonstrate that culture is a top 3 priority? And I've worked with leadership teams where we create a smorgasbord of possible questions that leaders could ask that demonstrate that culture is a top 3 priority. If this embedding is the key element of this, and we're either serious about this or we're not. That's it.
Yeah. Now, that's brilliant and genius. And for me, Steve, it's never been more important than it is now. And there are a few comments coming through, Richard, Peter, and a few others, who are just reinforcing for me why this conversation today was so important. So I think Richard and Peter are both from the UK, where there's a massive number of furloughed workers. So government's paying a chunk of salary at the moment, so not all of it, or maybe not. But here's the problem. They're not technically in the workforce at the moment. They're not technically involved in the activities of what's going on. And those furloughed workers might be sitting back, and Peter is one of them, and saying he might have that situation of saying, well, do I look around for a different job now? Am I ever going to get my job back? So you can't just think that people who have been furloughed are not part of this conversation either. Because if you want them back in the team at some stage in the future, if you're hoping that you can reignite your business and get them back in, you can't wait around and just let them have their own thoughts and go on their own. You've got to include them in the culture conversation. I mean, the complexities at the moment of culture are unbelievable. So what would you say, Stephen, and I'm laughing now as I look at the time, because I knew we wouldn't be able to hit the half an hour thing. We were aiming for a short conversation today. I knew we wouldn't do it. But what would you say to a leader now? What would be the 3 or 4 things that a leader, whether it's a leader of a small team or the leader of the enterprise, what should they do about culture right now? We've established it's vital and important, cannot be ignored, shouldn't be left up to chance right now. We shouldn't be thinking that you can just let what happens in the crisis, so be it. So what would you say the priorities should be now in the next few weeks for leaders?
Well, I mean, you've got a choice as a leader, I think, about how much down the culture path you want to go. And at the most superficial level, I would say be very conscious of, be aware of the UGRs that surround you, the UGRs that you create, the UGRs that you ignore. I learned a great deal from Doris, who is the head of a funeral company, great leader. UGRs in a funeral company, that was an interesting assignment. Doris said to me, I said to Doris, what have you learned from our work on UGRs? And Doris said, Steve, I've learned that leadership is all about what leaders don't do. I said, I don't understand what you mean. She said, I'm very conscious about tidiness. And the day I'm walking outside one of my funeral homes with one of my staff, and I look at the weeds growing in the garden beds and I do nothing, what's the UGR? Tidiness as other people's responsibility. So this is not confined to weeds in a garden bed. As leaders, what we walk past is what we sanction. And there are UGRs that are created from your action and your inaction as a leader. So we should have given a warning notice at the start of this session, Graeme. We should have, in red flashing lights. We should have said, warning, there is no off switch to UGRs. Because now that we've exposed you to UGRs, you will be inflicted by the UGR's curse forevermore. and that is that there is no off switch. You will tune into UGRs much more so now, and it's a bit of a curse because you'll see them everywhere. So me saying be conscious of them, I guess, is a bit redundant because you will be anyway. So that's at the shallow end. If you wanted to go in deeper, you could actually introduce your people to the concept of UGRs. You could have conversations around what our aspirational culture needs to be. You could do a UGRs stock take, which is our term for finding out what the current UGRs are by getting people to complete the sentence to the lead in sentences. And there's plenty at the UGRs website, which you can use as a resource if you wanted to go alone on that. But I mean, at its most fundamental, you've got a choice. Do I include culture as a top 3 priority? That's the fundamental choice.
Yeah. Listen, I'm going to do something that you were too much of a gentleman to do. That the deeper than deep end for your team is to contact Steve and get him to come and do this work with you guys now. One of the great advantages of being in this COVID-19 disruption is that you can probably get Steve to work with your business now when you might not have been able to before. I don't know why anybody chooses to live at the bottom end of the world down in Melbourne, but he does. And he enjoys his lifestyle way too much to travel all over the world. But now, of course, at a flick of a button, he can be wherever you are. And as you can see, he scrubs up pretty nicely on camera as well. So all of this can work remotely. So I'll do the sales job you were too polite to do. Go to ugrs.net, get all of their free resources, start working on it. And if you think you need a bit of professional help, you're not going to go wrong with engaging with Steve and his team. Are there any questions? I really appreciate it. My pleasure, Steve. Well worth it. Are there any questions from anybody coming in just as we look at the top of the hour? I know you've all got places to go and people to see and things to do today. No, joking. You've got other webinars to attend.
Yes.
So, Steve, while we're waiting, if there are any questions coming in, what haven't we said? How's that for the softball of softball questions? What haven't we said in the last hour that you think needs to be said about workplace culture at the moment? Well,
I've given up my best shot, I think, Graeme. I mean, there are nuances to all of this. I was going to show you some pictures that we took. We work with McLaren Automotive in the UK over a 4-year period, and I wasn't a car buff, but I am now because we went to Woking in Surrey. It is the most remarkable premises I've ever seen. Those of you who may be unaware, they have a Formula One team. We weren't working with that division. We were working with the division that makes road cars. Just phenomenal. And I was going to show you a slide of behind the security gates of a gardener measuring the height of a hedge. Yes, you hear correctly, measuring the height of the hedge. To make the point that there are very subtle ways that UGRs are displayed, but I would argue no less powerful. All of us have seen someone being berated publicly. That's an in-your-face UGR. But there are far less subtle, but I would argue no less powerful ways that UGRs can be picked up and disseminated. So those subtle ways are something I think all of us should be conscious of. And for a leader, it might be the raising of an eyebrow when somebody says something. And again, in this context, in a virtual context, it's even more dangerous because, when someone's speaking and a leader goes off camera or starts doing something, to the side, what is that saying to the person who's speaking at that time? So, these different cues in a virtual, which might be subtle.
A simple demonstration. I mean, if I just did that.
Exactly.
I might literally just have a speck of dust in my eye. But if you're watching on Zoom, and people need to know, everybody's watching on Zoom if you're the leader, you do that in the middle of somebody's statement, you've said 1,000 words, haven't you?
100%. That's a good example.
Yeah. Carla asks, is it possible to have one set of UGRs for a global business, or would you have different UGRs at different levels in the business, maybe because of different cultures or different areas of a business? So McLaren might be a good example. Would they have different UGRs in the Formula One team to the road car production business?
Well, that's a really great question, and the answer to that is yes. They were actually quite separate businesses. They interact, but through their technology, but they were quite separate businesses. So the answer to that is yes. However, I would argue that there are some, and it's right that even in an organisation there are different UGRs. So a marketing department, just by virtue of their personalities, will have a different flavour to an auditing department, just by virtue of their personalities. And that's generalising, I know, but I hope you take my drift. I would argue that there ought to be non-negotiable cultural attributes or values that we fight for, irrespective of where you work and your level of seniority. So, for example, respect might be one. We don't care where you work, what you do, what pressures are on you. Respect is not negotiable, if that's one of our values or cultural attributes. So it ought to be with your other values and cultural attributes. Now, these might be interpreted and displayed in different ways, maybe not so subtle if we're talking about different countries, because there are country UGRs as well, and regional UGRs. But I firmly believe there ought to be non-negotiable values or cultural attributes.
So, Steve, in fact, that gives us a wonderful segue to just sum up what we've said. Won't you just give us then, again, one more time, it is in the chat box for people to go back and read, but one more time as a way of summarizing this. If we're going to spend a few months in virtual spaces, in the next few months moving to hybrid work from home, work from anywhere, flexi time spaces, you and your team have identified what you think need to be 4 non-negotiable cultural attributes. Why don't you just not just list them, but briefly just summarize why you think they're important again, as a way of summarizing and kind of sending people into the rest of their day thinking about how to get the most out of this COVID disruption. Over to you for the final word.
Look, I keep thinking of this franchise senior leader who described his period as a bloodbath, and that it really got to me. And it was on the basis of that we decided that no, we're going to change the rules and say that there's 4 non-negotiables that we think have application in any and every business. Transparency, and this is in recognition of the fear, uncertainty and stress that everyone is feeling. Transparency, agility, creativity and innovation, and support and care. Now, if they aren't worth fighting for right now, I don't know what's worth fighting for. Transparency, agility, creativity and innovation, and support and care.
I think you nailed it. I think that if people focus on asking their teams and working with their teams to say, how do we get more of those 4 things? And what will it look like in our team if those 4 things were being evidenced? And then embedded that in their system, not only would you get through the next few weeks and months in better shape, I think you'll come out the other side of this disruption with a much better organization. And you could look back and say, we didn't just survive COVID, we actually revived ourselves. We built something during COVID that would be enduring afterwards. Steve, this is everything I was hoping it would be with an hour with you and your insights on workplace culture. I hope everybody else appreciated. If you're watching the replay, thank you for spending an hour with us. We appreciate your time and all the best. It is a bloodbath for many, many people, and we hope that some of this thinking around workplace culture will help get you through. One more time, go to UGRs.net for more information on what Steve does and to contact him and his team directly. Steve, thanks again for your time, mate.
Graeme.
Great chatting.
Thank you.